San Francisco Bay, 1962. A cold, unyielding monument rises from the deep. Alcatraz, the rock. For almost 30 years, it stood as the maximum security answer to the escape artist. The waters surrounding it were notoriously lethal. A relentless 4-knot current, paired with the icy 50-degree Fahrenheit temperature, made the 1.2-mile distance impossible for human survival. This formidable isolation was the prison's primary security measure, turning the environment itself into a ceaseless, silent guard. But into this fortress came the mastermind, Frank Morris. A career thief with an extraordinary 136 IQ, transferred to Alcatraz specifically because of his relentless history of successful escapes. Morris wasn't just a crook, he was a meticulous architect of liberty. He saw past the modern security layers to the prison's core, a deteriorating 1912 military structure. The constant assault of the salt air-laden fog had softened the old, hand-poured concrete around the ventilation shafts leading into the utility corridor. The utility corridor was an 8-foot-high, narrow, dusty, and forgotten space running along the back of the entire cell block. It was their key to the roof. Morris needed allies, men who were builders, not just brutes. He chose John and Clarence Anglin, brothers skilled in construction and highly resourceful. The fourth conspirator, Alan West, occupied the adjacent cell. He provided crucial support and would join them in the final moments. The operation was a 6-month-long commitment to silence, diligence, and repurposing every piece of prison scrap imaginable. Their tools were the epitome of ingenuity, spoons and silver dimes soldered together, creating crude chisels. A drill improvised from a stolen vacuum cleaner motor and electrical cords. To mask the noise of the chipping, they relied on the music hour, a daily period where inmates played instruments, drowning out the faint sounds of destruction. The pulverized concrete dust, the very evidence of their work, had to vanish. It was carefully collected and flushed down the toilets or sprinkled onto the already dirty floor. But the most critical part of their plan wasn't escaping the cell, it was convincing the guards they were still in the cell after they had left. They needed the perfect alibi for the hourly night count. They needed the ultimate decoy, the paper-mâché dummy heads. The material was meticulous: soap, concrete dust, paint stolen from the maintenance shop, and crucial real human hair collected from the barbershop floor. The decoys were designed to hold the illusion for hours under the dim yellow light of the guard's flashlight during the quick hourly passes. The most radical step was their transportation, an 11-foot inflatable life raft constructed from over 50 stolen raincoats. They used the heat from the steam pipes in the utility corridor, pressing the seams to create rudimentary but vital watertight seals. The pump for the raft was equally ingenious, a small accordion-style musical instrument adapted to quietly inflate the vessel. 6 months of meticulous planning and dangerous work finally concluded. The escape was scheduled for the night of June 11th, when the tides were optimally weak. Everything they needed was hidden: tools, the raft, and the will to risk the impossible. All they needed now was the cover of night. The plan was perfect, accounting for every factor except one: the human element. On the day before the escape, a cryptic final note was slipped to Alan West. The signal was given: tonight was the night. Inside Frank Morris's cell, the plan moved from preparation to execution. The first order of business, making the guards believe he was already asleep. The finished paper-mâché head, painstakingly crafted and now crowned with real hair, was placed on the pillow. The blanket was pulled up to the chin, leaving only the pale, still face visible in the faint light filtering from the corridor. An observer, even a routine hardened guard, would see only a prisoner resting. In the shadows, Morris began his ascent. Scaling the exposed heating pipes was a brutal task, requiring silent, controlled strength. His hands, calloused but slick with sweat, gripped the rusty metal. He reached the opening above and slid silently into the utility corridor, the dark, dusty lifeline that ran along the back of the cells. One by one, the Anglin brothers followed, their movements echoing the same cautious discipline. Their decoys, placed with the utmost care, replaced them in their bunks. But in the fourth cell, the human element faltered. Alan West, the essential link, was frozen by fear or hesitation. The damp concrete around his vent opening had hardened too much, and in his panic, he couldn't widen the hole enough to squeeze through. The other three called to him in strained whispers, their voices swallowed by the vast, dark emptiness of the corridor. They knew they could not wait. To delay was to risk everything. They had to leave him behind. The three remaining men moved quickly to the ventilation shaft that led to the roof. It was a perilous sheer climb, but one they had planned for. A network of makeshift ropes and footrests left from their earlier reconnaissance. Upward they went, their bodies scraping against the narrow, cold metal. They emerged onto the roof, where the wind hit them with a brutal, freezing force. They were not yet free, merely visible. They flattened themselves against the cold asphalt, the massive structure of Alcatraz, a dark shadow against the distant, glittering lights of the mainland. They traversed the entire length of the cell block, avoiding the blinding sweep of the guard tower searchlight, which passed every few minutes like a silent, slow-moving reaper. Their final obstacle was the pipe that ran down the north side of the prison, leading to the water's edge, a controlled, rapid descent. At the shoreline, tucked behind the incinerator plant, they retrieved the bundled gear. Under the spray and crash of the restless tide, they began the frantic, final assembly. They unrolled the 50 raincoats, now fused into a single, inflatable vessel. With the concertina pump, they began the exhausting task of inflation. The small pump worked, a slow, rasping whisper in the dark, and the rubber began to stretch taut. The raft was launched. The three men, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, slipped into the dark, icy water and pushed off into the swirling currents of the bay. They were free of the island, but now they faced the silent, deadliest guard of all, the relentless, unforgiving ocean. The three figures were immediately swallowed by the colossal, cold immensity of San Francisco Bay. They paddled furiously. Their improvised paddles, wooden slats they had smuggled out, useless against the ripping, four-knot current that grabbed the raft and began dragging it relentlessly toward the open Pacific. Their only hope was to reach the pre-planned landing point at Angel Island, roughly 2 miles north, before the current pulled them out past the Golden Gate. The icy water, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, permeated their clothes, sapping their strength and focus. The crude, steam-sealed seams of the raincoat raft began to weep, and water pooled rapidly at their feet. They paddled as one, their desperation fueling their exhausted strokes, their eyes fixed on the distant, dark mass of Angel Island. For 2 terrifying hours, they battled the elements. They were not seen. The fog and the late hour concealed their radical, black vessel from the few passing freighters. Then the rhythmic sound of the bay itself began to change, replaced by a new, subtle noise, a sloshing sound, indicating the raft was taking on water faster than before. They didn't know if they had made it past the worst of the currents. They didn't know if they were miles north, close to shore, or miles west, already drifting toward the ocean. As the first, weak light of pre-dawn began to touch the eastern sky, illuminating the choppy, dark grey surface of the water, the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris vanished into the dark turbulence, their raft slowly submerging into the freezing bay. The morning was cold, damp, and perfectly routine. At 7:15 a.m., during the first count of the day, a correctional officer paused outside Alan West's cell. West was still there, exhausted and defeated, finally managing to squeeze his body back through the enlarged hole in his cell wall just minutes before dawn. But down the row, the routine shattered. The officer reached Clarence Anglin's cell, peered through the bars, and saw a figure in the bed. He tapped the head lightly to wake the inmate. It rolled stiffly to the side. The officer froze. The air rushed into the prison block as the alarm sounded. Sirens wailed across the island. The dummy heads, which had held the illusion for 7 hours, were discovered. The search began instantly and with savage intensity. The guards poured into the utility corridor where they found the clandestine workshop. The tools, the sharpened spoon, the handsaw, the electric drill were gone. All they found were a few empty cans of paint, a scatter of paper-mâché scraps, and the immense, gaping hole in the roof ventilator shaft. The search immediately turned to the bay. Helicopters scoured the water, Coast Guard vessels cut through the choppy waves. Within a few days, the ocean began to return fragments of the escape. First, an improvised paddle-like oar was found 200 yards south of Alcatraz. Then, a few miles north, near Angel Island, a tightly rolled package of personal effects wrapped in rubber was recovered. It contained copies of the Anglin family photographs and various documents. The most crucial discovery came later: a deflated, badly water-damaged life vest constructed from the prison raincoats. The discovery of the vest, ripped and soaked, convinced the authorities that the men's raft had failed and they had drowned shortly after launching. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were officially presumed drowned. The legend of Alcatraz's impossible escape was born in the face of their alleged watery graves. The prison closed less than a year later, partly due to the embarrassment of the security breach. But the question has always lingered: did they survive? In the decades that followed, only tiny, compelling fragments of evidence surfaced to suggest they might have succeeded. A long-lost letter, supposedly from John Anglin, claimed they made it. Decades later, a grainy photo emerged, showing two men resembling the Anglin brothers in Brazil, living quiet, free lives. The truth of their fate was forever lost to the dark waters and the churning currents of the bay.